I had already lost my wife, my job, and nearly my sanity, but the real disaster hadn't even started. I had already lost my wife, my job, and nearly my sanity, but the real disaster hadn't even begun. It was not as though I set out to lose everything in one fell swoop, yet somehow that very catastrophe had become my ordinary existence. In the months since her passing, I had felt the world unravel beneath my feet with a slow persistence that left me breathless and unable to trust in tomorrow. I carried the weight of loss like a memorized tune, playing on endless loop inside my head. Missing her laugh, the emptiness where her voice used to be, the quiet absence at the dinner table where she should have smiled across at me, reminding me that no matter how bad things became, love still endured. My son and I existed in a fragile orbit, tethered to one another by mutual heartbreak and need, neither of us capable of bridging the chasm of grief that yawned between us. The works of time and uncertainty had erased my job, and with it, the structure I so desperately clung to. My sense of purpose eroded when I couldn't bring home a paycheck, couldn't provide for his small breakfast in the mornings, couldn't keep the lights on when we stumbled into another overdue bill notice. Every evening, after tucking him into bed, I found myself staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment when I sent that final job application, then his name slipping through my lips. "I don't know how we're going to make it," I told him, my voice cracking. Guilt flooded me then. Guilt for failing him. Guilt for wishing that somehow things were different. Guilt for waking each morning still thinking I could catch up on a lifetime of loss. Loneliness became my constant companion, the empty rooms in our house echoing with silence in which my own doubts reverberated until I felt I might shatter. I could no longer remember what optimism felt, like my heart burned with regret and fear, and I sank into the stark realization that nothing I did could ever restore what had been taken from me. Still, I rose each morning out of habit, feeding my son Cheerios and milk, because that was what a parent was supposed to do, even when every logical fiber in me screamed that I couldn't go on. Late one particularly cold and rainy evening, when the sky felt like a lid pressing down on my chest, and the rain tapped a hollow rhythm on the pavement, I stepped out of the house not with determination but with despair. I cannot say whether I intended to clear my head or to disappear, because the weight of that uncertainty itself was at once both frightening and oddly comforting. I let the rain soak through my coat and soak me with its prickly coldness, thinking the numbness might dull the ache inside. My footsteps led me into a blur of streetlights and puddles, reflecting a distorted world, and I walked without destination, as though the rain would wash away all the fragments of grief I supposed I even wished it might. I wandered along deserted streets, thoughts crumbling like rain-soaked paper around me. Where had it all gone wrong? Why was I still standing here? How would I keep going tomorrow? It was the kind of night where every sound seemed amplified. The distant siren winding through the dark, the splash of my shoes in puddles, the wind rattling the skeletal branches overhead. I wondered if my son was awake, imagining me lost somewhere I could not get out of. A gentle sob nearly escaped me then, but I held it in, feeling the weight of failure more acutely as I stared into the empty glass windows of closed stores, reflections of a man I barely recognized looking back at me. Then, just when the night felt thick enough to suffocate me, I rounded a corner and stopped dead. At first my tired eyes registered a blur of dark shapes huddled near a low wall along the curb, and I thought we were witnessing something impossible. A woman crouched, her clothes ragged and sodden, holding what looked like 5 small bodies close to her like fragile treasures. The children sat in a cluster against her, shivering from the damp, their limbs wrapped around her as though trying to melt into her warmth. I can still recall the way the streetlight overhead skimmed over the curve of her shoulder, the way the rain dripped in long, hesitant loops down her hair, and how the children's faces, pale and wide-eyed, stared into the night as though searching for permission to believe in kindness. Something about her eyes froze me in place. Not desperation alone, but a profound resignation, and just that single thing reached inside me and squeezed. These were not strangers playing actors in a tale too far removed from my own. Somehow I felt their story had always been simmering beneath my skin, waiting for a spark. My breath turned shallow. I told myself I should walk away, that their lives were not my affair, that I had no answers and no right to intrude but guilt. That relentless burden pulled me closer instead. The woman lifted her face toward me, and I saw the corners of her eyes dark and wet with grief, her expression refusing pity and yet pleading for something I could not name. I cannot be sure how long I stood there, seconds, minutes, an eternity. But in that moment, time was elastic, stretching me into someone torn between despair and the sudden, acute awareness of another human soul suffering. My heart pounded, every syllable of doubt dissolving into the rain. Could I just do something small? Anything? To help? But all I could manage was to remain rooted. The image of that broken family burned into my mind with a sharpness that felt like pain inflicted anew. Thus, the worst disaster had not even begun. Not then, not for me, but in that frozen instant, I realized that nothing in my life would ever be the same again. I saw a woman with 5 children huddled in the cold, and something about her eyes froze me in place. She wasn't just begging for help, she was begging for someone to see her pain. When I saw her again, I almost convinced myself it wasn't real. The woman I'd seen the night before, the one surrounded by 5 children beneath the flickering light of a corner street lamp, now stood just outside the entrance of a crowded grocery store. Her silhouette somehow smaller in the morning sunlight, but no less haunting. She wore the same oversized coat, water-stained and torn at the seams, clinging desperately to her thin frame like a second skin. Her hair was pulled into a messy knot, wind-whipped and tangled, as if she hadn't had a safe place to brush it in days. But it wasn't her clothes or her posture that caught my attention. It was the children, all 5 of them, standing in a quiet line beside her, faces blank, shoes missing, hands holding on to one another not for warmth, but for the comfort of being seen. They weren't asking for money. They weren't even holding a sign. They simply stood there, as people passed them by, some casting awkward glances, others pretending not to see at all. There was something deeply unnatural about how quiet they were. No fidgeting, no whining, no demands for food or attention. Just silence. Silence that screamed louder than any beggar's cry ever could. I stood across the street, watching her. I didn't know what I was waiting for, maybe for someone else to notice first, for someone more equipped, more capable, less broken than me to walk up and offer help. Part of me wondered if it was a scam, a setup, something staged to manipulate the soft-hearted into giving up their wallets. The world had taught me to doubt sincerity, especially when it came from strangers on the street. But even as that thought passed through my mind, something else clawed its way in a feeling, almost too raw to name. It was guilt, yes, but something deeper, something I couldn't rationalize away. It was recognition. I had known that kind of stillness, before the kind that only comes from too many nights spent going to bed hungry, too many mornings waking up wondering if someone will finally see you. I had seen it in my own son's eyes in the first few weeks after his mother died. I had heard it in my own voice when I lied to him about dinner, telling him I wasn't hungry just so he could finish what little food we had left. The stillness in those children wasn't born of discipline. It was born of desperation. I finally began walking toward them, still unsure of what I was going to do or say. As I approached, I could see more clearly just how exhausted the woman looked. Her cheeks were flushed red from the cold, her lips cracked. She was talking to no one, just staring ahead, as if staring long enough might make someone stop. I was maybe 10 feet away when one of the children, the smallest boy, maybe 4 or 5, turned his head and looked directly at me. His voice was so soft, I almost didn't hear it. "Mom said you'd help us." I stopped mid-step. The words hit me harder than they should have. My first thought, absurd as it was that they somehow knew me, that this was personal, that she was personal. But that was impossible, wasn't it? I searched the boy's face for familiarity, but I saw nothing but hollow eyes and thin skin. His words rattled around in my brain like loose change in an empty cup. "Mom said you'd help us." How could she have known anything about me? How could she have told her children that? I looked at her, hoping for answers, and for the briefest moment, our eyes locked. She must have seen the confusion in my face, because she looked away almost immediately, her jaw tightening with something that looked like shame, but there was pride there too. She stood straighter, pulled her children in a little closer, as if preparing herself for rejection. I realized then she hadn't expected help. Not truly. She had hoped for it, maybe. But that hope was buried so deep, beneath years of pain and silence, that even she no longer believed it would come. And yet, she had told her son something different. Somewhere in her, the smallest ember of hope still burned bright enough to light a promise. She had looked at me and told her child that I was someone who would care, someone who would not walk past. In that moment, I hated myself for hesitating. I hated how broken I had let myself become, how fear had become my compass, how quickly I had learned to look away from other people's suffering because I didn't know how to carry it. And I hated how much of her strength reminded me of my late wife. How both women, even in the depths of their pain, carried the weight of their children as though it was the only thing anchoring them to this world. I opened my mouth to speak, to ask her name, to offer food, money, anything, but before I could take another step, the noise of the crowd surged around us. A man brushed past me, carrying a large bag of groceries, and when I looked up again, she was gone. The space where she and the children had stood just seconds earlier was empty. No trail, no sign of where they had gone. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the sidewalk, the parking lot, even the alley beside the building, but there was nothing, no trace of them, no flutter of a coat, no sound of small feet tapping against pavement. It felt like I'd imagined the whole thing, but I knew I hadn't. My chest still ached from the weight of that little boy's voice. My hands still trembled with the chill that had run through me when she looked away. I had hesitated, and now she was gone. I stood there for a long time, watching people come and go, pushing carts full of food, sipping coffee, talking on their phones, living lives that didn't involve questions like, "Where are we going to sleep tonight?" or "How do I keep 5 children warm with 1 blanket?" They didn't see what I saw. Or maybe they had, and chosen to look away. As I finally turned, to walk back toward my car, I carried a gnawing feeling deep in my gut. Not just guilt, not just sadness, but something more personal. I needed to know who she was. I needed to know why she told her son I would help. I needed to know why, in the middle of my own storm, something in her pain had pulled me in like gravity. I turned back, hoping to catch one last glimpse of her, but she had vanished before I could speak. A single sentence written on a crumpled note tore open a part of me I'd buried for years. Sleep refused to find me that night. I lay in bed, fully clothed, staring at the dark ceiling as if it held the answers I couldn't begin to form. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that mother's face, the strain in her jaw, the quiet tremble of her arms as she held her children close, the weight she carried not just in her body, but in her spirit. And every time I blinked, I heard the boy's voice again, soft and sure, whispering, "Mom said you'd help us." It wasn't just his words, it was the certainty with which he said them, as if my existence had always meant something to his family long before I ever saw them. That moment had buried itself so deep into my chest, I could feel it echoing with every heartbeat. I had no idea who they were, where they had gone, or why she had looked at me like that, as though she recognized something in me that even I had forgotten. The regret that came from hesitating when I should have acted, it gnawed at me until the early hours of dawn. I didn't even realize I'd drifted off until the morning light cut through my bedroom window, stabbing my eyes and reminding me that the world hadn't stopped turning just because I was drowning in guilt. I got up before my son stirred. I didn't even leave a note on the table. I just grabbed my jacket, my wallet, and drove straight back to the spot where I'd last seen them. My hands were shaking as I gripped the steering wheel, not because of the cold, but because part of me already knew they wouldn't be there. I just hoped I was wrong. The parking lot was exactly as it had been: quiet, gray, almost indifferent. The same morning crowd passed through, loading carts, sipping coffee, living in a world untouched by what I had witnessed. But she and her children were gone. Not a single sign remained, no footprints, no discarded blanket, no trace of their presence. I stood there for several minutes, trying to convince myself to go home, to tell myself it was over, that they were just another passing sorrow I couldn't change. But then I glanced at the donation box near the side of the building, the one where I had dropped a few cans of soup and a small bag of groceries before returning home that evening. Something white stuck out from the corner of that bag, something that hadn't been there before. I walked over slowly, my throat tightening with every step. I reached into the bag and pulled out a small, crumpled piece of paper, folded 3 times and slightly damp from the condensation inside the plastic. My fingers hesitated before opening it, a part of me afraid of what it might say. When I finally unfolded it, a single sentence stared back at me in a rushed, jagged scrawl. "You haven't changed." I read it again, then again, and for a moment, the world spun sideways. My knees almost buckled beneath me, and I had to lean against the wall just to stay standing. I hadn't seen that signature in over a decade. I hadn't even heard her name spoken in years, but I knew it instantly. That one letter R, written with a small flourish at the bottom, was unmistakable. Ronnie, my wife's foster sister, the girl who had lived with her for 3 short, painful years in a foster home they both rarely spoke about. The girl who had disappeared without a word when she was barely 16, swallowed by the system, lost in a world that didn't care to find her. My wife used to cry at night, wondering if Ronnie was safe, if she'd ever find her again. She tried searching. Records were sealed. Trails ran cold. Eventually, she stopped looking, not because she stopped caring, but because she couldn't keep reopening that wound. When my wife died, Ronnie's name was still written on a torn piece of notebook paper in her old journal. It had one line beneath it: "I hope you're still out there." I remember reading that after the funeral, holding the book in my hands like a sacred thing, and wondering if this girl, this mystery, had even known my wife was gone. And now, here it was. Her note. Her words. Not from a memory, not from a journal, but placed directly into a bag I had left just hours earlier. She had seen me, recognized me, knew who I was. "You haven't changed." That could only mean one thing: she remembered me. But how? I had only met her twice, both times awkward and brief, when she visited my wife during the early days of our relationship. She had always been quiet, skittish, as if she was still expecting someone to yank her back into darkness at any moment. She never stayed long. And after her last visit, she vanished. I stood there, the paper clutched in my hand, trying to make sense of what felt like a ghost reaching out through time. The crumpled edges, the rushed handwriting, it wasn't just a message. It was a breadcrumb, a sign that the woman I had seen wasn't just any struggling mother. She was Ronnie. And those children were hers. 1,000 emotions surged through me at once: shock, disbelief, sorrow, confusion, and a deep, rising fear I couldn't place. If she had seen me and left this note, why didn't she come forward? Why vanish again without saying anything more? Why the secrecy, the silence, the coded message? And what was she running from now? I turned the note over, almost out of instinct, and there it was, faded but visible. A second line, written in smaller letters beneath the fold. "We're not safe. If you want to help, come find us." Then an address. My heart thudded so hard I thought the paper would slip from my hands. The address wasn't far, maybe 15 minutes away on foot, a rough part of town, buildings that had been left to rot, places you didn't visit without a reason. But now, I had a reason. I folded the note carefully, slid it into my jacket pocket, and looked around one last time, making sure no one was watching. I didn't know what I was walking into, or whether this was a good idea, or even a safe one, but I couldn't walk away. Not this time. The note also included an address, and I knew I had to go. The house was supposed to be empty, but it breathed like it remembered me. The address led me through streets I hadn't walked in years, past shuttered storefronts and sagging fences, down a neighborhood where every corner carried a memory of things lost or forgotten. These blocks didn't welcome strangers, they tolerated them. Paint peeled from windowsills like old skin, weeds burst through cracked sidewalks, and the houses stood not in rows but like survivors clinging to one another in quiet desperation. And at the very end of one broken street, I found it the place I never expected would be real. It didn't look like a home. It looked like a ghost had tried to live there and given up halfway through. The roof sagged in the middle, as though burdened by too many years of rain and grief. 2 of the windows were boarded from the inside, and the front door hung crooked on rusted hinges. And yet, something in the air told me this place wasn't as dead as it wanted the world to believe. For a moment, I stood at the edge of the overgrown lawn, staring at the structure in silence, trying to hear something beneath the wind and the rustling branches. And then I did. Faintly, from inside, came the sound of laughter, not just one voice, but several, high-pitched and unrestrained, the kind of laughter that belongs only to children who have momentarily forgotten their fear. I stepped closer, my pulse quickening. Could it really be them? I climbed the creaking steps and raised my hand to knock, but hesitated. What if this was a mistake? What if I had read too much into the note? If I was chasing a ghost through a maze of my own imagination? But the thought vanished the moment my knuckles met the door, the sound echoing softly into the house beyond. The door opened slowly. No chain, no hesitation, just a slow, steady pull. And there she was. She didn't speak. Neither did I. For a full 5 seconds, we just stood there, frozen in the space between disbelief and recognition. Her eyes widened, not with fear, but with the stunned realization that I had come. That I had read her message, followed her trail, stood on her doorstep. She looked thinner than I remembered, older, worn down in a way that had nothing to do with time and everything to do with surviving. Her lips parted slightly, as if she meant to say something, but no words came. "May I?" I asked quietly, nodding toward the interior. She stepped aside without answering, opening the door fully and allowing me to step inside. The air was thick with the smell of dust, old wood, and something faintly sweet, cooked apples, maybe, or cinnamon, something comforting, clashing with the visual decay of the house around me. Inside, the walls were mostly bare, stained with age and rain. The floors creaked beneath our steps, but the space was lived in, undeniably so. A makeshift curtain hung across a broken window, and piles of folded blankets lay neatly in one corner. A mattress with no frame sat against the far wall, surrounded by backpacks, toys, and half-empty food containers. There was no furniture beyond a rusted folding chair and a crate used as a table. But it was clean, remarkably clean, and it spoke of care, of someone doing the best they could with almost nothing. The children were in the back room. I could hear them whispering now, no longer laughing, as if they sensed something had shifted in the atmosphere. Ronnie, though I still hadn't said her name, closed the door behind us and stood with her back against it, arms crossed tightly across her chest, as if holding herself together through sheer will. "I didn't think you'd come," she said, finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, unsure what to say. Every word I had planned, every question I'd rehearsed, evaporated in the face of her presence. She was real. She was here, and so was the past I thought I'd buried with my wife. "I didn't think you were still alive," I replied, and the moment the words left my mouth, something in her expression cracked. She motioned for me to sit on the crate while she took the chair. Her hands trembled slightly as she pushed strands of hair behind her ears, her eyes never quite meeting mine. For a long moment, we said nothing, and then she stood, walked to a small drawer beside the mattress, and pulled out a thin, weathered frame. She handed it to me with shaking hands. The photo was old, the colors faded, edges curled, but I knew it immediately. 2 girls stood side by side in front of a white house with a chipped red door. One of them was my wife, smiling, her arm slung around the other girl's shoulder, eyes full of life and hope. And the other was Ronnie. She looked younger, maybe 13, wearing a sweatshirt that hung off one shoulder, her face half hiding behind her sister's confidence. My throat closed. I held the photo like it might shatter if I breathed too hard. I couldn't stop staring at it, at their bond, frozen in time, untouched by all the pain that came later. "I found this the night she died," Ronnie said quietly, sinking back into her chair. "I came to the funeral, you know. I stayed at the back. You never saw me." I looked up sharply, stunned. "You were there?" She nodded. I didn't know what to say. I was too late. Emotions swirled, grief, anger, regret, something close to betrayal, all tangled together. "Why didn't you say anything?" I asked. "Why vanish all those years ago? Why hide now?" Her gaze dropped to the floor. "Because I was a mess. I still am. But back then, I was afraid. Afraid they'd take me away again, send me somewhere worse. I was just a kid with too many secrets and no one to trust. When I left, I never meant to disappear forever." She paused, inhaling shakily. "And when I saw you last night, I didn't know if you'd even remember me. I just hoped. Hoped you'd recognize something. That you'd care. I did care. I cared more than I could explain. And then, without fully realizing what I was saying, I whispered, 'Ronnie?' She looked up. Her eyes were filled with tears, not just from hearing her name, but from hearing it spoken with something she hadn't felt in years. Familiarity. A link to someone who once loved her unconditionally. A tether to a past that still had meaning. And then, silently, she nodded. I whispered, 'Ronnie?' And she nodded with tears in her eyes. She wasn't a stranger. She was the missing piece of my wife's broken childhood. I sat in stunned silence, the photo still in my hands, Ronnie's name hanging in the air like the last note of a forgotten song. The years hadn't just changed her face. They had hardened her eyes, stretched her spirit thin, and left behind the kind of tiredness that sleep could never fix. But behind the exhaustion, the hunger, the worry etched into her brow, I could still see it traces of the girl I barely remembered, the girl my wife used to talk about with both fondness and sorrow, like a dream that once kept her company and then slipped away in the dark. "She talked about you all the time," I said eventually, my voice breaking through the silence like glass. "After we got married, she told me about the home, the way you two used to hide under the covers and pretend the world outside didn't exist. She never stopped looking for you." Ronnie smiled sadly, her eyes drifting toward the cracked window, where a sliver of late afternoon light crept in through the grime. "I never stopped thinking about her either. But by the time I found the courage to come back, she was gone." I wanted to ask her what had happened in between, why she had disappeared so suddenly, where she had been all those years, but something in her body language told me she wasn't ready to tell it all at once. She sat stiffly, her hands clasped in her lap, as if holding herself together by sheer will. Her gaze flickered over the photo once more, then toward the sound of her children playing softly in the next room. "She and I were inseparable for those 3 years," Ronnie began slowly. "We were placed in the same foster home when I was 9 and she was 11. It wasn't a kind place, but having her there made it bearable. We used to sneak cookies at night, tell each other stories to stay sane. When I got scared, she'd hold my hand and promise we'd run away together someday and never look back. I felt something ache in my chest, hearing that the voice of my wife echoing in Ronnie's memories. I could picture it, those 2 little girls clinging to each other in the dark, building their own little world where no one could hurt them. But that never happened," Ronnie continued, her tone flattening. "When I turned 13, I got moved. Different house, different rules. At first I thought it was temporary. I kept asking for her, but no one cared. They told me to forget about her. After a few months, I stopped asking. 'What happened after that?' I asked gently. She looked at me, eyes hollow, but not without strength. You know those stories people tell about running away, hitting the streets, just trying to survive? That was me. I thought I was tough. I thought I could handle it, but I was just a kid." Her voice wavered, and for the first time, she looked ashamed. "I ended up with the wrong people. There was abuse, drugs. I stayed clean as much as I could, mostly for control, but it got dark, real dark. I was barely 15 and living in shelters, sometimes parks. One night, I overheard someone talking about a girl with my name being listed as missing but unsearchable. I knew then she must have been trying to find me. "She was," I said softly. "She even hired someone. But they said your trail was cold. Foster care records sealed. Too many dead ends." Ronnie nodded. "That's what saved me. Knowing she was looking, somewhere out there. I started trying to stay in one place longer. I got a job cleaning at a gas station, met someone who seemed kind, who offered me safety. I was young. I wanted to believe people could change. She stopped there, and I didn't push. I could already see the pain stretching across her face. Her next words came slower, weighted with history. "He wasn't kind," she finally said. "Not for long. At first, it was just yelling. Then came the bruises. But by then, I was pregnant. I didn't know where to go. I thought maybe a baby would soften him. It didn't. I stayed. I had 5, and every time I thought about leaving, I looked at their faces and couldn't figure out how I would keep them alive on my own. But eventually, the beatings got bad enough, and one night, when he was passed out, I took them and ran." "How long have you been running?" I asked. 2 years, she whispered. "We've moved cities 3 times. I don't use real names. I take cleaning jobs under the table. We stay in abandoned houses, squat where we can. We've eaten food from trash bins. Sometimes strangers are kind. Sometimes they're worse than what we left." I couldn't speak. The enormity of her story, of her survival, wrapped around my throat like a rope. "I tried to go back," she added suddenly. "Last year, I finally saved enough to get to the town where she used to live. I was going to knock on her door. I was going to beg her to forgive me." She looked away again, and this time I saw the tears rising. But it was too late. A long silence fell between us. I didn't move. I didn't offer platitudes. I knew better than to speak when grief was the only language left. She stood up and paced the room, as though if she stopped moving, the truth might crush her. Her arms wrapped tightly around herself, but there was something unshakable in her stance now. A defiance that said she might be broken, but she was still standing. "I have no one left," she said, "except them. Those kids are the only reason I'm breathing. And even that's getting harder." I stood slowly. "You're not alone anymore." She looked at me then, eyes sharp with disbelief, then quickly softened, as though a part of her had waited years to hear those words. "You don't understand," she said. "He's looking for us. He never stopped. And if he finds out where we are, we don't have much time," she whispers. "He's looking for us. We don't have much time." She wasn't just poor, she was hiding from a monster. I had thought hunger was her greatest enemy, that homelessness and poverty were the battles she fought each day. But as Rani's story unfolded, I realized how wrong I had been. She wasn't just poor. She wasn't just struggling. She was running from something, or rather, someone whose shadow loomed larger than any hunger or cold night could. It wasn't desperation that had hardened her edges. It was fear. Pure, unrelenting fear. We sat in the dim light of that crumbling house, the air heavy with silence, and I watched her stare at the floor as if replaying every decision that had led her here. She didn't speak at first, and I didn't rush her. I could see the fight within her, the war between staying quiet to protect what little safety she'd built, and the need to finally let someone in. "He used to say he owned me," she said finally, her voice low and cracked, as though each word was being torn out against her will. "He said, once you let someone into your bed, you owe them everything." I believed him for too long. I didn't need her to explain who she meant. The man she had mentioned before the father of her children wasn't just a violent partner. He was something darker, something vile and predatory. I could hear it in her voice, in the careful way she chose her words, like someone afraid of speaking too loudly even when he wasn't there. He had broken more than her trust. He had taken pieces of her that might never be returned. "He has friends," she continued. "Not the kind who ask questions. Cops, guys in dark cars, people who owe him favors or money. When I ran, I didn't just leave him. I stole from him. I took the kids, yes, but also things he said were his. I grabbed cash he kept hidden, phones, a hard drive he was obsessed with. I don't even know what's on it. I just took what I could find to buy time." It chilled me how casually she said it, as though she had made peace with the fact that her life would never be safe again. Rani hadn't simply walked away from an abusive man. She had severed herself from a world that would forever hunt her for daring to escape. "I change names every few months," she said. "Sometimes we're in shelters, sometimes in abandoned places like this. I don't let the kids go to school. I teach them myself, as best I can. I scrub toilets at night, clean gas stations, do laundry in back rooms, anything under the table, anything without paperwork. Do they know? I asked, nodding toward the room where the children had gone quiet. Bits and pieces, she replied. The older two understand more. The younger ones just think we move a lot. I tell them we're explorers, that we're looking for a magic place where everything will be okay. Her voice cracked slightly then, the first break, in her otherwise tightly woven armor. And I suddenly understood what kind of strength it took to keep 5 children believing in a world that didn't believe in them. She wasn't just surviving, she was crafting an illusion every day, one that shielded their innocence even while her own heart bore the weight of horrors they might never fully know. I felt torn in two. On one side was the instinct to help her, to bring her and the children somewhere safe, to get legal aid, housing, maybe even therapy. On the other side was my own child, my son, who had already lost one parent, who barely had me keeping him steady. If this man Ronnie was running from really was as connected and ruthless as she described, then I wouldn't just be risking her life, I'd be gambling with my son's safety too. I don't know what to do, I said, almost to myself. How do I help you without putting him in danger? She didn't flinch. You don't. That's why I left the note instead of coming to you directly. That's why I disappeared. I didn't want to drag you into this, but you showed up anyway, and now you know. Her eyes locked with mine, and there was no blame in them, just quiet resignation. If he finds me, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, he'll come for you too. Anyone close to me becomes leverage, collateral. I've seen what he does to people who cross him. I swallowed hard, the weight of her words settling into my chest like a stone. I believed her. Every word of it. There was no drama in her voice, no exaggeration. Only the cold, exact tone of someone who had survived too much to tell stories for effect. My instincts screamed at me to walk away, to tell her I was sorry and that I had a son to protect. But something deeper, something I couldn't shake, told me that walking away would haunt me for the rest of my life. I had stood by once before, let someone suffer alone, watched helplessly as my wife lost the battle against her own silent war. I couldn't do it again. Just as I opened my mouth to say something, what I still didn't know, a sharp noise cut through the house. It was the kind of sound that makes your body react before your brain has processed it fully. A crash, a muffled thud, and then a child's voice, panicked and shrill. Mom, something's wrong with Maya. Ronnie jumped to her feet and bolted toward the back room. I followed her without thinking, my heart slamming against my ribs as fear surged through me. We burst into the room, where the oldest boy knelt beside one of the younger girls, Maya, maybe 4 or 5, who lay limp on the floor. Her cheeks flushed a deep, alarming red, her skin soaked with sweat. Ronnie dropped to her knees, pressing the back of her hand to the child's forehead, and I saw the dread wash over her face. She's burning up, she said, her voice trembling. She was fine this morning. I knelt beside them, unsure what to do, feeling that familiar helplessness grip me again. She needs a doctor, I said. She could be dehydrated, or worse. You can't risk this. Ronnie's eyes filled with terror, not just for her daughter's condition, but for what going to a hospital might cost her. Paperwork, questions, exposure, and maybe a trace that could lead the monster she had escaped right to their door. We don't have a choice, I said more firmly. You'll lose her if we wait. Suddenly, one of the kids collapses, burning with fever, and our window to stay hidden begins to close. Saving her daughter meant risking everything, including exposure. The moment I felt Maya's skin, slick with sweat and burning with unnatural heat, I knew there was no more time left for hesitation or debate. Whatever fear Ronnie had of being seen, of being traced, of becoming visible in a world she had worked so hard to stay invisible in, it had to come second now. This wasn't a scrape or a cold. This was something serious, something dangerous, and if we waited even a few more hours, we might not get another chance to help her. She needs a hospital, I said, louder than I intended, my voice trembling with urgency. Ronnie, crouched over her daughter with eyes wide and wet with fear, looked up at me as if I'd just suggested we throw ourselves to the wolves. Her lips parted, but no words came, only the raw panic of a mother forced to choose between safety and saving her child. "I know what hospitals mean," I said more gently. "But I also know what happens to kids who don't get help in time." For a few agonizing seconds, she didn't move. Then, in a sharp motion, she nodded. "Okay," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Okay. But we can't use our real names. We can't sign anything. We have to be ghosts." I didn't argue. I scooped Maya into my arms, shocked by how light she felt. Her eyes were barely open, her breathing shallow and uneven. She clung to me for just a moment before slipping fully into unconsciousness, and the weight of her limp body against my chest lit a fire under my feet. The drive to the hospital was a blur. Ronnie sat in the back with Maya's head resting in her lap, whispering soft reassurances in a language I didn't understand but felt deeply. I kept glancing at her in the rearview mirror, watching the way her eyes darted to every passing car, every corner, every red light, like she expected him, the man, to leap out at any second. And for the first time since we'd met, I began to feel that same paranoia sinking into my bones. We arrived at the emergency entrance just after sunset. The triage nurse took one look at Maya and rushed us inside. The smell of antiseptic, the pale green walls, the coldness of the metal chairs, it all felt like stepping into a different reality, one where time moved both too fast and not fast enough. When the nurse asked for our names, Ronnie froze. I stepped in quickly. "Her name's Anna. Last name, Miller. I'm her uncle. My name's Greg." The nurse didn't blink. She jotted the names down and ushered us into a curtained-off room where another nurse immediately began taking Maya's vitals. I held my breath the entire time, praying we wouldn't be asked for ID, praying they wouldn't check records. I knew hospitals were busy, especially in the ER, and that anonymity was still possible in the chaos. But that didn't stop the cold sweat that had broken across my back. A doctor arrived, and within minutes, they were administering fluids through an IV and monitoring her fever, which had climbed past dangerous levels. Ronnie sat in the corner, her hands clenched into fists, her knees bouncing uncontrollably. I tried to comfort her, but she wouldn't meet my eyes. I knew what she was thinking. Every beep from the monitor, every footstep outside the curtain, it wasn't just a hospital staff member to her. It was a possible link, a breadcrumb, a threat. "She'll be okay," I said finally, once the doctor assured us the fever was being managed. They said it was dehydration and an infection. We caught it in time. But Ronnie didn't respond. Her eyes were fixed on the curtain, her body rigid. "We should go," she said flatly. "Now, before they start asking more questions." We waited another hour before they discharged Maya, no questions asked, the staff too overwhelmed to notice the inconsistencies in our story. Maya was groggy, weak, but her fever had broken, and she clung to her mother's hand like a lifeline. We wrapped her in my jacket and walked out into the night. The hospital doors sliding shut behind us with a hiss that felt final. But it wasn't the end. If anything, it felt like the beginning of something worse. As I pulled the car out of the parking lot, I noticed it 2 cars back, idling in the shadows. A dark SUV, windows tinted, no headlights on. At first, I told myself it was nothing, just a coincidence, a stranger waiting for someone inside. But as we made 3 turns through quiet neighborhoods and it followed each one, I knew. "Ronnie," I said quietly, trying not to startle Maya, who was drifting in and out of sleep beside her. "We might have company." She turned sharply, looked through the rear windshield, and her breath caught. "It's him," she whispered. "I know it. I can feel it." I made another turn, then another. The SUV stayed behind us for 3 more blocks, then turned off down a side street. But the damage was done. We drove the rest of the way in silence. Our nerves stretched thin, every flash of headlights in the rear-view mirror setting off a fresh wave of fear. When we finally reached my house, I parked a few blocks away and walked the last stretch on foot, carrying Maya again, while Ronnie kept close, glancing over her shoulder every few seconds. We slipped inside without turning on the lights, and I locked the door behind us, drawing every curtain tight. The kids were asleep within minutes, their bodies exhausted beyond reason. Ronnie sat in the kitchen with a cup of water, her hands shaking so badly she couldn't drink. "I shouldn't have let you help," she said suddenly. "This was a mistake. I've put your son in danger. I've put you in danger. I should have disappeared again." "No," I said firmly. "We saved her life. You didn't make a mistake." But even as I said it, I wasn't sure I believed it. The feeling of being watched hadn't left me. I moved through the house like a man in a dream, checking every window, double-locking every door, trying to convince myself we were safe for just one night. Then, just before midnight, I walked past the living room window and froze. Parked across the street, under the cover of darkness, was the same black SUV. That same car appears outside my home later that night. I looked into the eyes of the man chasing her and saw nothing but violence. For hours, the black SUV didn't move. It sat across the street like a shadow with its engine off, windows dark and headlights silent. I tried to convince myself it was coincidence, that paranoia was playing tricks on me. But when Ronnie saw it through the gap in the curtain, her reaction confirmed what I already feared. Her face went pale, lips slightly parted, eyes wide and locked in place. She didn't speak right away, didn't scream, didn't run. She just stood frozen, the air around her thick with the kind of fear that only comes from knowing the thing you've been running from has finally caught up. "It's him," she whispered, and though her voice barely made it out of her throat, it carried more weight than any shout could have. "That's his car." I didn't ask how she was so sure. I could see it in the way her entire body tensed, her hand instinctively reaching for the nearby wall as if she needed something solid to anchor her to the ground. She had stared into that car too many times, had memorized the shape of it, the way it lingered, the silence that always came before the storm. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by the front window with the lights off, watching the SUV. It stayed for 3 hours, then finally pulled away, disappearing into the distance without a sound. But the damage had already been done. Safety, however fragile, had been shattered. There was no going back to pretending it might be over. The next morning, I made the only decision that felt right. I told Ronnie and the kids they would stay here, in my house, where I could keep them close, where I could watch the door myself, where I wouldn't have to imagine what might happen to them if I let them go. At first, Ronnie resisted. She didn't want to bring her darkness into my home. She didn't want my son exposed to the dangers chasing her. But eventually, with tears in her eyes and exhaustion in her bones, she agreed. My house changed overnight. What was once quiet and solemn became filled with whispers, cautious movements, the shuffle of little feet across creaky floorboards. My son, confused but kind, tried to make space in his world for the strangers who now shared his breakfast table. Ronnie tried to stay invisible, taking care of the kids silently, cleaning dishes that weren't hers, folding blankets with precision like she was repaying some debt that couldn't be forgiven. But despite the calm inside, the fear outside only grew. Every time a car passed slowly, every time the floor creaked unexpectedly, my heart seized. I kept my phone in my pocket at all times, and every night before bed, I checked every lock, every curtain, every window twice. I didn't tell my son what was really happening, but children are perceptive in ways adults forget. He knew something wasn't right. He stopped asking why the curtains never opened. He stopped sleeping with the door to his room closed. We considered going to the police, but Ronnie was hesitant. "He's smart," she said. "He's careful, and he knows how to work the system. He won't come at us with fists in front of witnesses. He'll watch, he'll wait, and then he'll find a way to twist everything." I believed her. I had seen this type before, the kind of man who walks freely because he knows just how much pressure to apply without leaving a bruise you can prove. I still called the non-emergency line and reported the car anyway. They took my statement, said they'd look into it, but I could tell from their tone they didn't take it seriously. There were no threats, no incidents, no proof, and I wasn't family. I was just a guy letting strangers sleep in his living room. For days, things stayed quiet. The SUV didn't return. The kids started to smile again, cautiously. Ronnie even laughed once, just once, when my son showed her a drawing he made of all of us holding hands in front of the house. For a moment, it felt like maybe this nightmare was just passing through. But the thing about monsters is they don't knock when they come back. They creep. They watch. And then, when you're most vulnerable, they strike. It was late. The kids were asleep. Ronnie and I were in the kitchen, cleaning up after dinner. The kind of mundane moment that almost made us forget the storm we were hiding from. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Just outside the window. I froze. So did she. We didn't breathe, didn't move, just stood in perfect silence as the sound of deliberate, heavy steps passed slowly across the porch. There was no knock, no attempt to open the door. Just pacing, listening, waiting. I reached for my phone, ready to call the police, but by the time I reached the window, the sound was gone. Whoever had been there had vanished back into the shadows like smoke. I opened the door just a crack and looked out. Nothing. No car. No figure. Just the stillness of night and the echo of something that didn't want to be seen. We barely slept. I sat at the front of the house all night again, Ronnie nearby, her eyes never closing, her hand occasionally gripping mine like it was the only thing keeping her anchored. By morning, we were both hollowed out from fear and exhaustion. I called the police again. This time, I demanded someone be sent. They arrived hours later, took another statement, made a patrol around the block, and gave me the same empty reassurance I'd heard before. That evening, the doorbell rang. The sound was so sudden, so ordinary, it felt wrong. Ronnie tensed, her eyes wide with dread. I walked to the door cautiously, heart pounding, half expecting to see him standing there with that smug, calculated calm she had described. But it wasn't him. It was two women in crisp business casual clothing, clipboards in hand, expressions neutral in a way that was somehow more terrifying than anger. "Child Protective Services," one of them said, holding up a badge. "We received an anonymous tip about children living in an unfit environment." The doorbell rings and it's Child Protective Services. When they tried to take the kids away, I realized I loved them like my own. The woman from CPS didn't raise her voice or show any expression that suggested she already knew what she was walking into. In fact, that was what made it more terrifying how neutral, how composed, how disturbingly calm she remained as she stepped into my home and asked to speak privately. The second worker followed closely behind, taking quiet inventory of everything in the living room, blankets stacked neatly on the couch, children's drawings tacked to the walls, the dishes drying beside the sink. They weren't looking for violence or bruises or obvious neglect. They were looking for paperwork, stability, legal ground, things we didn't have. Ronnie stood stiffly beside me, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her eyes fixed on the floor. She had been through this before. I could see it in the way she stopped breathing the moment the word custody was mentioned. She already knew how these visits ended. Her children, each one born from love but raised in fear, had always been one phone call away from being taken by strangers in suits who spoke with soft voices but made decisions that left scars. We received a report that several minors are living in this residence, under the care of an adult who is neither their legal guardian nor biological parent, the first woman explained, her tone carefully non-confrontational, as if trying to comfort us while also dismantling everything we had built. "Can you tell us about your current living situation?" I glanced at Ronnie, who didn't move, and realized the responsibility had already fallen to me. "They're here for safety," I said slowly, choosing my words with care. "The children's mother is with them. She's not hiding from the law. She's hiding from danger." "We understand there's a history of domestic violence," the second worker added, glancing at a file in her hands. "But the report we received was about stability, not safety. Without legal guardianship, you may not have the right to keep these children in your home." I had no response. Not a legal one, at least. Everything they said was true. On paper, I was no one. A man who took in 6 strangers without notifying any authorities, without filing a report, without even asking if it was allowed. And in a world run by procedures and policies, the truth didn't matter if you didn't file it in triplicate. They didn't remove the kids that night. They said there would be a formal investigation, that we'd be notified before any next steps were taken. But I saw the look in their eyes, the silent conclusions already forming. I saw Ronnie's face fall as she realized that the thing she feared most wasn't a man in a black SUV. It was the quiet system that could smile while separating her from her children without a trace of malice. The moment the door closed behind them, she collapsed into a chair, her hands covering her face. I sat across from her, silent. I had no words. What could I possibly say that wouldn't sound empty? That evening, we explained it to the kids the best way we could. That some people had come to check if they were safe, that it didn't mean they had done anything wrong, that we were going to make sure they stayed together. But the oldest boy, Eli, didn't believe us. He'd seen this before. He'd watched his mother pack and flee in the middle of the night too many times to believe in calm voices and empty promises. Later that night, I found my son sitting on the floor outside his room, his knees pulled to his chest, his eyes rimmed with tears he didn't want me to see. I sat beside him, not asking questions, just waiting. "I don't want them to go," he said finally. "It's been better since they came." I swallowed hard, unsure how to respond. My son had spent the last year growing up in silence, in a house that echoed with loss. He never complained, never asked why things had changed so quickly, never once brought up his mother's name, unless I did first. And now, after so long, after so many nights of quiet dinners and empty weekends, he had people again, laughter again, noise that didn't feel heavy. "We'll do everything we can to keep them," I promised, even though I didn't know how. The next morning, I started researching. Guardianship, emergency foster arrangements, adoption laws. I called lawyers, left voicemails, read pages of government websites I barely understood. I stayed up late filling out online forms, bookmarking every legal aid resource I could find. Some told me the process would take months. Others said without Ronnie's full cooperation and without proof of abuse, the court could grant custody to the father if he filed for it. I didn't tell Ronnie at first when I found out that her ex had already done exactly that. The formal complaint came by mail 3 days after the CPS visit, a crisp envelope with a court seal and her name misspelled across the front. Inside was a notice. A custody hearing had been scheduled. He was seeking full parental rights. He claimed she was unstable, unfit, homeless, and hiding the children from him illegally. His signature was at the bottom, scrawled in confident ink. I handed the letter to Ronnie that night and watched the light in her eyes dim. "He wants to parade into court in a clean shirt and pretend he was always the victim," she whispered. "He'll bring witnesses who owe him, say I'm dangerous, that I'm poisoning the kids against him. We won't let him win," I said, not because I knew we could, but because I needed her to hear it. We sat together on the floor, surrounded by legal documents and empty coffee mugs, while the children slept in the next room, unaware that their fate was already being decided. Then, just before midnight, another envelope slid under the door. I picked it up slowly, already knowing what it would say. It was the official court summons. We receive a court summons custody hearing in 5 days. The courtroom wasn't just about law, it was about love, trauma, and healing. The courthouse didn't look like a place where lives would be forever altered. Its beige walls and flickering lights felt cold, clinical, indifferent to the raw emotions that pulsed in the hearts of those who walked its corridors. But the moment we stepped through those glass doors, I felt it, the tension, the weight of what was coming. We weren't just here to attend a hearing. We were here to fight for 6 lives, and every breath I took reminded me that we could lose everything in a matter of hours. Ronnie sat beside me on the wooden bench outside the courtroom, her hands clenched together so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. She hadn't spoken much since the summons arrived. Her body moved through the days, as if in a daze, attending to the children, keeping them fed and warm, helping them smile when she could, but the spark in her eyes had dimmed. I could feel her preparing for the worst, building walls around her heart in case the system did what it had done so many times before. Strip a mother of her children under the guise of protocol. When our case number was called, the courtroom doors creaked open, and we stepped inside. It wasn't dramatic, no shouting attorneys or packed gallery, just a judge at the bench, a court clerk, 2 CPS representatives, and the man we had been running from, seated calmly beside his lawyer. Ronnie froze the moment she saw him. He wore a dark suit, his hair slicked back, his expression neutral, even warm, as if this were a business meeting and not a custody battle. He didn't look at her. He looked at the judge with quiet confidence, the kind that only comes from knowing how to play the system. We took our seats. The judge, an older woman with a stern but fair face, began by reading the file aloud. It was all there: CPS's report, the anonymous tip, the lack of legal guardianship, the claim filed by the biological father, the children's current living conditions. It felt clinical, detached, as if she were summarizing a list of ingredients rather than recounting a family's entire survival story. Then came the questions. "Mr. Morgan," she began, turning her gaze toward me, "you are not a biological relative of these children. Is that correct?" "Yes, Your Honor," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "And yet you have allowed them to live in your home for several weeks, without notifying authorities?" "Yes, because they were in danger. And you understand that harboring minors without legal consent is a serious violation." "I do now. At the time, I just knew they had nowhere else to go." She nodded, scribbled something down, and continued. "Do you have children of your own?" "Yes, one son." "And he lives in the home as well?" "Yes, ma'am." Her gaze was unreadable. "And do you believe it's appropriate to place your own child in potential danger by sheltering a woman and 5 children fleeing from an allegedly abusive man?" I paused. This was the question, the one that had kept me awake every night. "Yes, Your Honor. Because I believe protecting others is what I want my son to learn, and because I trust that doing what's right sometimes comes with risk." There was a murmur in the courtroom. Ronnie squeezed my hand beneath the table. The judge made another note. Then came the other side. Ronnie's ex stood, slowly, when called. He adjusted his tie, walked calmly to the center, and began speaking as if reading from a script. He talked about his estranged children, about how he'd been unfairly denied access, about Ronnie's unstable history, and how she'd traumatized the kids by dragging them across state lines. He mentioned rehab, shelters, untraceable income. He never raised his voice. He never showed anger. He was measured, articulate, and terrifying. "She is not well," he said, glancing at the judge but never at Ronnie. "I'm here to provide a stable environment, structure, education, safety, that's all." He didn't mention the bruises. He didn't mention the nights she spent hiding in abandoned houses, the meals skipped to feed their children, or the terror in her eyes every time she heard footsteps behind her. The courtroom wasn't built for nuance. It was built for paperwork, records, and reputation. Ronnie remained silent during his testimony, staring at her lap. But I could see the tremble in her shoulders. She wasn't afraid of losing the argument. She was afraid no one would believe her side of it. When it was my turn to testify, I stood slowly, heart pounding so loud I could barely hear the clerk swearing me in. I told them everything: how I met Ronnie, what I saw that night at the store, how her son said something only someone connected to my late wife would have known. I explained how she had run not out of recklessness but to protect her children, how I watched her go without sleep, food, and peace for the sake of 5 small lives. I told them about Maya's fever, the hospital visit, the SUV that followed us home, and how I had come to love these children as if they were my own. "I want to adopt them, Your Honor," I said finally, "or become their legal guardian, if that's what it takes. They deserve a safe home, and they've become part of mine." There was a long silence after I spoke. The judge didn't move. Her eyes didn't leave mine. She tapped her pen once, then looked down and began writing again. "I appreciate your statement," she said, "but this court requires more than heartfelt testimony. We need full accounts, evidence, backgrounds." She paused, then turned to Ronnie. "And that means you, Miss Rivers, will need to testify in full." Ronnie's head shot up. "I need to hear your story, under oath, tomorrow morning. In detail, everything." The judge orders Ronnie to testify in full, under oath, the next morning. She stood before a judge and poured out every scar she'd hidden for years. The courtroom was colder that morning, or maybe it was just the weight of what we all knew was coming. Ronnie sat beside me in the front row, her hands trembling as they clutched the hem of her sweater, the same one she'd worn when we met, worn thin in places but somehow still holding together like her. Her face was pale but composed, a calm forged not from peace but from exhaustion. She didn't speak much on the way to court, just nodded when I offered to drive, kept her eyes on the window as if memorizing the shapes of things she might have to leave behind. The judge called her name, and the room fell into an uneasy silence. She rose slowly, each step toward the witness stand deliberate and steady, not because she wasn't afraid, but because she had no choice but to walk anyway. When she took the oath, her voice didn't waver. She didn't glance at the man seated on the other side of the room. She didn't flinch when he crossed his legs and leaned back in his chair with a smirk that only I seemed to notice. She just stood straight, looked at the judge, and began to speak. At first, her words came measured, controlled, the way someone might rehearse them in their head 1,000 times before ever saying them out loud. She talked about the early years, about meeting him when she was young and scared, alone, and looking for something that felt like safety. She spoke about how charm can feel like protection, how attention can be mistaken for love when you've never known either. But as she continued, something in her voice began to crack, not with weakness, but with the force of too much truth, pressing against years of silence. She talked about the first time he hurt her, how he apologized afterward, how he brought her flowers and promised it would never happen again. She talked about how those apologies stopped coming, how the bruises became normal, how she learned to speak softly, move carefully, think 2 steps ahead of his rage. She described nights spent locked in closets, mornings where she couldn't get out of bed from the pain, weeks where her children didn't ask why she cried in the bathroom because they already knew. She paused then, her eyes filling but not spilling. "They never had a birthday party," she said. "He said they didn't deserve one, said I was raising them to be weak. I used to wait until he passed out, and we'd whisper happy birthday in the dark, just the 6 of us. I'd make cupcakes from old bread and peanut butter and tell them it was a cake. There wasn't a sound in the room, not from the lawyers, not from the judge, not even from the CPS agents who had remained largely silent up to that point. Ronnie's voice carried across the space like a thread, binding us to her, drawing us into her story not as spectators but as witnesses. She told them how she ran, how she'd waited for him to fall asleep, gathered her children into garbage bags packed with whatever food and clothing she could find, and walked 2 miles to the nearest bus stop at 3 in the morning. How she used a fake name, dyed her hair in a gas station bathroom, and began a life of hiding not because she was trying to deceive anyone, but because she knew the truth would never be enough on its own. "They didn't know how to laugh," she said softly. "Not really. But when we met him," she turned, slightly, and looked at me for the first time since she started speaking, her eyes steady, warm. "When we met him, they smiled. They smiled without asking for permission." My chest tightened as I watched her. I had never seen someone break and rebuild themselves in the span of a single morning. But there she was, raw, vulnerable, telling her truth in front of strangers and her abuser, not to get sympathy, but because her children deserved a mother who could fight for them, even when everything inside her wanted to run. The judge leaned back, her pen paused in midair. For the first time in the entire hearing, her eyes weren't scanning documents or typing notes. She was listening not just to facts, but to pain, to love, to survival. Then, one of the CPS agents stood up. Her name was Miss Carver, and she had been neutral throughout the case, careful not to offer support or judgment. But now, with her folder open in her hand, she cleared her throat and said, "Your Honor, after hearing Miss Rivers' testimony and conducting additional background checks, we would like to update our recommendation." The courtroom tensed. Even the opposing lawyer straightened in his seat. "We believe," she continued, "that it is in the best interest of the children to remain in the care of their mother, with Mr. Morgan as temporary guardian while the adoption process is reviewed. We recommend denying the father's custody petition based on credible evidence of past abuse and long-term neglect." It was the first time I saw Ronnie's ex react. His jaw clenched, his smile faltered, and his lawyer leaned over to whisper something in his ear. But it didn't matter. For the first time since this began, the tide had shifted. The judge nodded, scribbled something down, then looked up. I appreciate everyone's cooperation. Given the gravity of this case, I will issue my ruling tomorrow morning. Court is adjourned. The gavel fell, and just like that, it was over for now. We stepped outside into the hallway, the air thick with tension that hadn't quite released. Ronnie was quiet, her shoulders low but not defeated. I didn't say anything at first. I just walked beside her, giving her space to breathe, to absorb what she had just done. Later that evening, back at home, after the children had gone to sleep and my son had quietly curled up with a book in the corner, Ronnie and I sat across from each other at the kitchen table, the silence between us finally softening. "You were brave today," I said, watching her face as she traced the rim of her mug with her finger. She didn't look up. I was terrified. "That's what made it brave." She exhaled slowly, then lifted her gaze. "I've never told anyone all of that. Not in one sitting. Not even my sister." I reached across the table and gently took her hand. It was cold, but steady. "You didn't just survive," I said. "You gave them a reason to hope." She blinked, tears rising again, but this time not from pain. Maybe from relief. Maybe from something closer to peace. Then she said something I didn't expect. "If we win tomorrow, if we're allowed to stay, would you still want to adopt them?" That night, Ronnie and I talk and she asks something I didn't expect. I thought I was rescuing them, but in truth, they were saving me. The final court day arrived with the same gray sky that had hung over us during the first hearing, but something inside me felt unmistakably different. This time, I didn't walk into that building as a stranger caught in the whirlwind of someone else's fight. I walked in as someone who had chosen to stand between 5 children and the uncertainty that had always followed them. I walked in as someone who had already made a decision, even if the court had yet to make theirs. Ronnie sat to my left, her fingers interlaced with mine beneath the table, her other hand resting gently on Maya's back, who had insisted on sitting between us for luck. The others were with a caretaker in the waiting room, their nervous chatter echoing faintly down the corridor. My son sat behind me, too old now to pretend he didn't understand what was happening, and too kind to say he was scared. His silence spoke volumes. He had waited for this moment in his own way, and I could feel the hope radiating off him like a quiet Sunday. The judge entered, her robes sweeping across the floor as she took her seat. She didn't look at us right away. Instead, she shuffled through a thick stack of papers on her desk, the sound of pages turning, making the room feel smaller. I knew the decision was already made. The paperwork had been filed. But still, the room held its breath. "Before I deliver my ruling," she said, her voice calm but commanding, "I want to say something." Everyone leaned forward slightly. In all my years on this bench, I have seen every type of case. Custody battles, abuse allegations, broken families stitched together and pulled apart again. But rarely have I seen a situation that so clearly shows what love, protection, and true family look like. She looked up then, her eyes meeting mine, then Ronnie's. This court recognizes that biology does not define parenthood. The willingness to sacrifice, to fight, to love without expectation. Those are the qualities we must honor. She paused, then reached for a single document and slid it forward. Permanent guardianship is granted to Mr. Morgan, with full consent and support from Child Protective Services. Miss Rivers will retain joint custody, and the adoption process may proceed with court supervision. The room didn't erupt in cheers. It didn't need to. The silence that followed was more powerful than any celebration. I felt Ronnie's breath hitch beside me. I felt my son's hand land gently on my shoulder. I felt Maya's small arms wrap tightly around my waist. And I felt myself exhale for the first time in weeks. Tears blurred my vision, but I didn't try to stop them. Ronnie was already crying, one hand covering her mouth, the other reaching for her children as they rushed into the courtroom, unaware that the walls around their future had just been rebuilt stronger this time, permanent. We hugged, we laughed, we cried in a tangled circle of arms and gratitude. Even the CPS agent who had once walked into my house with suspicion in her eyes now smiled quietly from the back of the room. No words were needed. The paper had been signed, the law had spoken, and for the first time in a long time, no one was running anymore. That night, we returned home, not to the space we had once called a shelter, but to the house that had grown into something far greater. It didn't feel temporary anymore. It felt earned. As I walked through the doorway, my son at my side and 5 other children trailing behind him, I realized something I hadn't before. I had started this journey thinking I was a broken man, trying to do one good thing. I believed I was helping someone else rebuild their life. But somewhere along the way, they had helped me rebuild mine. Every late-night conversation, every whispered thank you in the dark, every time I found a crayon drawing tucked into the corner of the fridge, all of it had healed me in ways I hadn't even known I needed. My son, who had once been quiet and withdrawn, now had 5 siblings who treated him like a hero. He taught them how to play video games, how to build Lego spaceships, how to cook microwave popcorn without burning it. They gave him laughter again. They gave him noise, chaos, hugs, and messy dinners, and I watched the sadness in him dissolve like snow in sunlight. Ronnie and I had grown closer too, though it never felt forced or rushed. There was something sacred in the way we moved through our shared space now, like 2 people who had learned to trust without needing to define every feeling that passed between them. We didn't talk about love, not yet, but it was there. In the way she handed me coffee in the morning before I even asked. In the way I checked the locks at night because she slept deeper when I did. We began to build a home, not just walls and furniture, but rituals and laughter and healing. The kids had their own beds now, mismatched blankets and pillows collected from donation centers and old friends. Each one had a drawer with their name on it. They helped paint the walls, even if most of their help resulted in smudges and drips. We put up photos on the refrigerator, drawings of our growing family, lists of favorite meals, and countdowns to birthdays they'd finally get to celebrate out loud. We argued, of course. We had bad days. There were tantrums and missed school assignments and spilled milk and more laundry than I thought possible. But there was also joy, the kind of joy that sneaks up on you when you least expect it. A shared glance across the dinner table, the sound of 6 different giggles rising from the living room, the simple, stunning realization that this is what family feels like. And as I stood one evening on the porch, watching the sun dip below the edge of our street, listening to the muffled sounds of children inside, I knew something I hadn't known at the start of this story. I hadn't just opened my home to strangers. I had opened my heart, and they had walked in like they had always belonged there. Losing everything led me to the family I was meant to have. If this story touched your heart, let me know in the comments what moment stayed with you most. I read every single one. Your thoughts and support mean the world to me. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss more powerful stories like this one. And if you know someone who needs a reminder that family can be found in unexpected places, share this video with them today.